Gentleman, and also for his success in gaining this, and I apologise to all concerned because I have a meeting in the Treasury very shortly, and I will have to go to that. But I do want to ask this question that he would ensure that he asks this almost certainly of the Minister, who will no doubt be answering. The security issue, as he knows I'm concerned, as sanctioned by the Chinese government, as others as well, that there is full and due diligence on such a potential merger, particularly with CK and the Li family being so knowingly involved with Chinese government committees and also with their contacts within Chinese government and under the national security law, also having to pass data over. I wonder if you would make sure and ensure that the key question on that is that the government is able publicly to assure everybody this will not take place unless these security issues are clarified and are not security issues at the end of this.
Thank you, Sir George. The Right Honourable Gentleman made important points, and national security is vital. I pay tribute to his work on this issue, and I pay tribute to all members of IPAC in the House of Commons and House of Lords who are active in that campaign group. I'm happy to give way again, yes.
Honourable friend, for giving way again. When there was the issue about Huawei installing their equipment, one of the arguments that was made at the time was that, well, this was the hardware, and therefore the telecom companies, and indeed that the national security, would be able to keep track of the software. But these companies now are deeply involved in the software. Doesn't that make these systems even more vulnerable to possible influence by the Chinese authorities?
Thank you, Sir George. An important contribution. I think the point about the hardware side and the software side both are quite open to interference. I accept that, and I hope the Minister will be able to address these concerns from members. The point I was making, Sir George, was following a merger, Three's ultimate parent company, CK Group, will become a group of significant control over a business that will serve 40% of the UK's population. Evidence suggests that there is extensive collaboration between the CK Group, the Li family, which controls it, and the Chinese state. It is well documented that the Li family have strongly backed pro-Beijing hardliner John Lee as the chief executive of Hong Kong and supported draconian new security law that would suppress dissent. On top of this, top CK Group executives sit on Chinese government committees and have access to inner circle of the Chinese elite. Does the Minister feel comfortable with a hostile foreign actor potentially having access to millions and millions of UK citizens' data? Last month, Sir George, I wrote to my local police force, Greater Manchester Police, sharing my concerns about the impact that such a merger would have when Greater Manchester Police is just one of the many police forces that have contracts with Vodafone at present. I'm aware that Unite the Union is happy to provide a list of police forces with contracts with Vodafone, so I would urge members across the House to contact the local forces to seek assurances about security and privacy measures in light of this. I implore the Minister to meet with Unite to discuss these concerns as a matter of priority. I also have grave concerns that China's domestic and counterintelligence laws and Hong Kong's national security law may pave the way for China's security services to obtain confidential data from companies like CK Hutchinson. While in theory the UK law prohibits the collection or transfer of individual user data, in practice there have been numerous examples in the UK and elsewhere where data has been accessed and transferred to China. Can the Minister give his assurances that he will do all in his power to prevent this from happening? The issue is, can the Minister assure us they will do all in their power? But I remain worried, Sir George, that this is not enough to stop sensitive UK government communications being exposed. It goes beyond the police. Vodafone has contracts with the Ministry of Justice and the National Health Service too. The recent report by the Commons Intelligence and Security Committee found, and I quote, that the UK is of significant interest to China when it comes to espionage and interference, and notes that China uses all possible legitimate routes to acquire UK technology, intellectual property and data, but that such overt acquisition routes have been welcomed by the government for economic reasons. Now would be a good time for the government to relinquish themselves of that allegation and to put British customers and our national security first. In the past, Sir George, the Prime Minister met yearly with the Intelligence and Security Committee. I hope the Minister will give his assurance to the House that the Prime Minister will reinstate those meetings. Now would be a good time when faced with this significant merger and a litany of other national security threats. Unite the Union has commissioned analysis from digital security expert Dr. Alexei Drew, academic and Director of Tech Security at consultancy Penumbra Analysis. Dr. Drew found the potential merger created substantial security risks, noting that domestic laws and internal company policies will do little to hinder the existence of nation-state intelligence gathering apparatus from leveraging any means of access to data that company mergers and acquisitions might enable. If a merger creates a technical or human means to collect valuable data, then the security services of any nation-state, Chinese or otherwise, are likely to make use of it. The government has said that it will assess this risky merger through its investment security unit. So what stage is the ISU's assessment at, and will the acquisition be called in for a further national security assessment? Knowing what we know about these proposals, they seem wrong on so many levels. It is bad news for British customers, will result in significant job losses, and it plainly poses a national security threat to the UK. Perhaps things would be very different if the government actually had an industrial strategy for the UK and was not asleep at the wheel while our national infrastructure got sold off to hostile actors. In light of all of this, I would be interested to hear the Minister's contribution and if he supports this merger. If he supports it, why does he support it? If he doesn't support it, what is he going to do to stop this merger? Thank you, Sir George, for allowing me to make this contribution.
It is important these issues are known and talked about. One that became increasingly apparent is that the merger has raised profound national security concerns. The Honourable Gentleman from Wilfred Green referred to that, and I think that's the issue for many of us here as well. There have been claims of associated groups of 3 UK associating with the Chinese state and aligning themselves with some of the most repressive Chinese policies. This could ultimately mean the privacy and security of 27 million UK customers is at stake. I have no doubt whatsoever that the new Shadow Minister indeed the Shadow Minister for the Scots Nats Party will also highlight these issues, which is why we feel that the Minister's response is so important. We're hearing of new breaches, new data complications, and the misuse of people's information almost every day. It never seems to end. Indeed, you wonder sometimes exactly what's going on. The utmost priority for Vodafone and 3 UK as part of a merger is to ensure that their customers' data is not at risk from anyone or any state, China specifically. To conclude, Sir George, and just to say this merger has a capability to impact many aspects of people's daily lives. Lois said that millions of customers could benefit from better 5G coverage. If it was just that alone, then that would be the good part of it. But it's more than that, and that's what this debate's about. We must ask ourselves at what price this is going to cost us, and it costs our constituents, costs us in security, costs us in our pockets, in our constituents' pockets as well. So I encourage the Minister to think of all these issues and do as much as possibly can be done to ensure that this does not penalise or disadvantage or in any way affect the security of our constituents. Again, to the Honourable Member for Stockport, well done. Thank you very much.
We've been here before. It's only 3 years since we engaged in a whole pile of debates about Huawei and the threats posed to national security by the involvement of the Chinese state actor within our 5G network. And despite repeated warnings from allies and security experts, the Tories went ahead and awarded Huawei a huge contract to deliver the UK's 5G network. Only after months of debates, of questions and of condemnation did they do a final U-turn to revoke the contract, but not before Huawei had begun their work. This meant not only was the security risk introduced, but the removal of Huawei from the 5G system cost an estimated somewhere between £2 and £3.5 billion. The UK government's intransigence in the face of these warnings cost taxpayers a huge amount of money. We should have learned the lesson. But now it would appear we're getting ready to hand over control of key infrastructure to the CK Group, the parent company of Three. Following such a merger, the CK Group will become a person of significant control, as the Honourable Member for Stockport pointed out, over a business that will serve 40% of the UK's population. Unite the Union has uncovered extensive collaboration between the CK Group, the Lee family, which controls it, and the Chinese state, with a number of CK Group executives sitting on Chinese government committees, with access to the inner circle of Chinese political elite. This has to raise serious questions about privacy and security for UK consumers that CK Group has done nothing to address. Under the Chinese government's state security laws, it would be possible for personal data of all users of this new merged company ending up in the hands of the Chinese government. Now, that's bad and bad enough, but Vodafone currently hold UK government contracts for the NHS 111 helpline, for the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Defence. And police forces, thank you. Now, added to that, strategic national assets in the form of Vodafone's subsea telecommunications cables between the UK and the US would also pass to the CK Group. Quite simply, madness. But the difficulty, if we look at who is profiting, we've also got to look at some of the government benches. Now, there's 2 Tory MPs that actually are on CK's payroll. So we've got to, it's in their register of interests, so it has been declared. So the UK government must ensure full diligence and protect customers from Chinese state surveillance and not override these security concerns. So from the Minister, we need assurances that this merger does not compromise national security in any way, shape or form. The 2 profitable companies will hold the data of 27 million UK consumers. They have critical government contracts. So will the government take a consumer first and national security first approach to any regulatory checks? What steps will the Minister be taking to ensure that large job losses don't result from any merger? This can't be allowed to become a repeat of the Huawei scandal, where ignorance and intransigence not only put consumers at risk, but also cost billions in an eventual U-turn. Security of the telecoms network and of users' data must come first.
Let me turn to the security issues. The merger will require the approval of the Investment Security Unit, which has been moved from the Business Department to the Cabinet Office. In effect, that means it will be a decision for the Prime Minister in relation to the security issues concerned. I don't want to exaggerate the security issues, but it is worth bearing in mind that the new company would have to handle extremely sensitive material regarding 27 million customers, as well as contracts, as has already been said, for the NHS, the Ministry of Justice and the MOD. These contracts are presently with Vodafone, not with 3. In the case of the Ministry of Defence, for instance, Vodafone was recently awarded a contract to provide video conferencing and recording services to UK military courts in cases relating to sexual offences. I think that's an important matter that we should be considering very carefully. So the question is, does it make sense to give such a role to a company, CK Hutchinson Holdings, which owns 3, which is a Hong Kong-based and Cayman Islands-registered conglomerate that was only formed in 2015? So my questions for the Minister in relation to this are, what assessment has the government made of the relationship between CK Hutchison and the Chinese state? If the merger were to go ahead, how would the government seek to guarantee the security of national and personal data? Would the government, for instance, consider carving out government contracts from the deal? Under the provisions of the Telecoms Security Act and the government's designated vendor direction, all telecoms operators are meant to strip Huawei from 5G by the end of 2027. What progress has been made on that to date? And what in particular has been done at 3 and at Vodafone? What impact does the government feel that the Chinese security law in relation to Hong Kong have for 3 and CK Hutchison Holdings? Can the Minister also tell us what stage this decision is presently at on these security issues? Will any decision and the reasoning behind the decision that the government comes to be published? Will Parliament be engaged in any way in the process? The Minister will know that the Intelligence and Security Committee has expressed its concerns about the process already. They said, the fact that the government does not want there to be any meaningful scrutiny of sensitive investment deals is of serious concern. Effective parliamentary oversight is not some kind of optional extra. It is a vital safeguard in any functioning parliamentary democracy. I would argue that in particular in relation to a situation where the Chinese state has sanctioned several members of parliament, that, including, incidentally, the security minister, that is an important matter for us to consider. Given the recent stories about Chinese state attempts to infiltrate Westminster and serious concerns regarding Chinese involvement in other parts of our national infrastructure, how will the government ensure that the merger, if it were to go ahead, would not undermine national and personal security? One final point in relation to this. How will the government ensure that all meetings of government ministers with CK Hutchinson and its subsidiaries are published in full and in good time in case there were to be any inappropriate lobbying? Sir George, I just want to say one final thing, because we're partly talking about China, which is that next week will be the 1,000th day of the incarceration of Jimmy Lai, who is a British national, and I think all members of this House would want to record the fact, we won't be sitting next week, but would want to record the fact that we believe that he has been incorrectly and inappropriately held in custody, and we would like to see him free.
Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to address in detail a lot of the points because they do relate either to the competition authority or indeed national security. And there is also a national security mechanism in place which he will be aware of. As the Honourable Gentleman knows, the deal that is on the table between Vodafone UK and 3UK will be subject to regulatory approvals. This debate has concentrated a lot on the potential national security implications, and I will say a little bit about that, and as also on the competition impacts. In general, the government welcomes investments into the UK which will support growth and jobs, which will meet our legal and regulatory requirements and do not compromise our national security. But as I think everybody who has participated in the debate has stressed, the security of critical national infrastructure is of prime importance. This government has a strong record in putting in place much tougher measures through such things as the National Security and Investment Act and the Telecoms Security legislation. And in particular, the Honourable Gentleman will be, and other members will be aware of the actions that have been taken around Huawei and the removal of Huawei technology from the core network. The Honourable Gentleman referred to that and the target of achieving that by the end of 2027. I can tell him that we are on track. In terms of the national security implications, as I say, that is a process for which there is now an established procedure. The Honourable Gentleman for the opposition is right to point at the role of the Investment Security Unit, which now falls under the Cabinet Office, but several honourable members during the course of the debate, I think particularly the member for Birkenhead and indeed the member for Strangford, raised concerns about the lack of parliamentary involvement in that decision. Of course, national security issues have always been kept confidential of necessity, but we do recognise that there does need to be some parliamentary oversight of economic security measures. So for that reason, in March this year, the government did agree a memorandum of understanding with the then Bayes Committee, obviously now the Business and Trade Committee, setting out arrangements for parliamentary scrutiny of the operation of the NSI Act and the Investment Security Unit. This establishes arrangements to allow the committee to access the information it needs to fulfil its scrutiny role, including setting out key principles on how and when the government and the committee expect information to be shared and protected. And the memorandum acknowledges that the committee does have a wealth of experience in scrutinising the operation of the Act, and we are keen to give the committee the information that it needs to carry out its work. And obviously, the Intelligence Security Committee has a separate role in monitoring the work of the intelligence agencies. but it is up to them to look at whatever aspect of the work of the agencies that they should choose to do so. So I'm sorry that I'm not able to go into detail on a number of the issues that have been raised by honourable members, but I can at least recognise that this debate has provided an opportunity for them to be put on the record, and I'm sure that the questions raised, which are legitimate ones, will be properly taken into account when the merger is examined, both by the CMA and by, if it triggers the process under the National Security and Investment Act. On that basis, Sir George, I would like to thank members for their participation.